Hey, what's up? Thank you for joining me for another episode of the Roots Podcast. Today, I want to talk about a topic that you may or may not be familiar with: the the topic of indigenous republics and Spanish republics within the Spanish Empire. So, in Spanish, these are referred to as Republicas de Indios and Republicas de Españoles. Civic life within the Spanish Empire was based very much within cities and towns. I know when we hear the word República, we tend to think of an entire country, right? Like La República de Mexico, or, the American Constitutional Republic. But in colonial times, a República referred more to a local town or a local city. The entirety of the country was not referred to as a republic because it wasn't a republic. The entirety of Nueva España was referred to as a viceroyalty, but the local towns were referred to as republics. So there weren't that many Spanish cities, but the Spanish population was very much concentrated in those cities. So those were big cities. They were much bigger than the average indigenous town. But on the other hand, there were about 4,000 indigenous towns all over Mexico. Now, these 4,000 towns, these were towns that had a positive relationship with the Spanish monarchy. It amounted to about 90% of the indigenous population. So 90% of the indigenous population in colonial Mexico, and this is by 1810, lived in indigenous republics. These were towns with self-governing rights. Remember, if you were an enemy of the Spanish Empire, you did not have self-governing rights. So if you had an indigenous republic, or if you lived on one, you were in a relationship with the Spanish monarchy, the colonial system. And so this basically was the bulk of the population of Nueva España by 1810. So as I said earlier, there were native groups that did not have a relationship with the Spanish Empire. They didn't have any kind of, treaty with Mexico City. These were natives that lived on the periphery. Again, they were mostly nomadic tribes. And so those ones never had self-governing rights that were recognized by the Spanish Empire. Many of those nomadic groups never became Catholic. Again, in order to become a citizen of the Spanish Empire, to have citizenship rights, you had to be Catholic. So, there were some natives that simply were never absorbed into the system. But what's fascinating about all of this is even after Mexico became independent, pretty much those same groups that were at war with the Spaniards were then at war with the Mexican government. Mexico also had the same laws that you had to be Catholic in order to be a Mexican citizen. So not much changed in that respect. So, if they were hostile to the Spaniards, they viewed Mexicans in the same light even after independence, because Mexicans were essentially the descendants of those Spanish settlers and their allies. In 1821, more than 80% of the colonial armed forces were people who were born in Mexico. These were Spanish Mexicans, also known as the criollos. These were mixed race people. And so in 1821, they switched sides and joined the movement for independence, and they became the Mexican army. So all these Spanish military bases up north, they were called presidios. All of those colonial soldiers just became Mexican soldiers, like literally the same people. They just, in many cases, they just lowered the Spanish flag, the flag that was used at the time in the Spanish Empire, and just raised the Mexican flag and continued working. It was really, it really functioned like that. But in central Mexico, the bulk of the indigenous population lived on a Republica de Indios that had self-governing rights. Now, these Republicas de Indios, they had their own councils, their own cabildos, but they also had, in lieu of having an alcalde mayor, the leader of an indigenous town was called a gobernador, a governor. Now, for the most part, and this is with very few exceptions, maybe the elites had private property, but the vast majority of indigenous people in one of these indigenous republics, they owned the land collectively. In each and every one of these Republicas de Indios, for the most part, they all had land titles that recognized their rights to their land. In many cases, or perhaps most cases, These indigenous people were living on land that they had lived on even in pre-Hispanic times. And so when the Spaniards formed peace treaties with these individual native communities, the viceroy and the Spanish monarchy would issue a land title that recognized the rights of those natives to own their land. These land titles became very, very important in Mexican history. So I could do a separate video on this, but in 1909, when Emiliano Zapata was organizing his community to fight back against the Mexican government, he was fighting for the Mexican government to recognize his community's land title that was issued by the King of Spain in 1607. So think about that. Zapata, the hero of the Mexican Revolution, was actually fighting for the Mexican government to recognize his community's land title that was issued in 1607. After independence, and really beginning in the 1850s, all of these indigenous land titles were invalidated, or the vast majority of them were. And so that gave rise to the powerful hacendado class that we usually associate with Porfirio Diaz. Well, these hacienda owners became powerful precisely because Mexico invalidated the communal land titles that these indigenous communities had and that were issued by the King of Spain. And rather than giving them, Mexican equivalents of these titles, the Mexican government invalidated them altogether. But that's a separate video that requires much more detail, so I'll cover that in a different episode. Anyway, getting back to the Republica de Indios, a typical Republica de Indios had two elements to it. One was the town government, and that was presided over by the gobernador. And then also it had a land title that protected its land rights. And this helped the community to function and to continue to exist. With these land titles, criollos and mestizos and European Spaniards could not buy indigenous land. It was illegal for a non-indigenous person to own indigenous land. Now, these two republics, the Spanish Republic and the Indigenous Republic, these were the two basic elements of Nueva España. And really, this model occurred all throughout the Americas. Now, this dual system of government ceased to exist after Mexico's independence. With the Constitution of 1824, Mexico eliminated racial distinctions in law. And so if there were no racial distinctions, there were no longer indigenous republics and Spanish republics. They were all Mexican cities and towns. Everybody across the country who was Catholic was granted Mexican citizenship so long as they pledged allegiance to the new government. So now, because of this new arrangement, a Mexican citizen of mostly European ancestry could get elected to office in a primarily native town, and a native person or a person of mostly native ancestry could get elected to office in a Spanish town. However, the land titles were a completely separate issue. And so after independence, now that these racial distinctions were eliminated in law, it became much more difficult for indigenous communities to protect their communal land titles. And after the 1850s, the Mexican government began invalidating communal land titles altogether. And so this policy of displacing natives from their, political rights, from their land rights, over time turned Mexico into a country of landless peasants by the late 1800s. And ultimately, this led to the Mexican Revolution by 1910. So I think I'm going to end the discussion right there. We've covered a lot today, but thank you all for tuning in, and I'll see you all again next week.